The Southern Alberta Council on Public Affairs acknowledges that we are gathered on the lands of the Blackfoot people of the Canadian Plains, and we pay respect to the Blackfoot people, past, present, and future, while recognizing and respecting their cultural heritage, beliefs, and relationship to the land. We offer respect to the Métis and all who have lived on this land and made Lethbridge their home.
Today's speakers are Genesis Molesky and Ross Kilgour on the Land Use Bylaw Renewal, Shaping the Future of Lethbridge. Please welcome them.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Genesis Molesky, and I work for the City of Lethbridge. In my role, I work with community members, developers, and city administration to support any redevelopment efforts in older neighborhoods. This is my colleague, Ross.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. So I'm a senior community planner, so I work with Genesis in the planning team in planning and design. And so similar to Genesis, I focus on redevelopment of existing areas. Genesis and I co-manage this project that we'll be speaking with you about today.
Thank you. So thank you for having us. We're excited to share information about the Land Use Bylaw with this group. The purpose of today is to give you a sense of what the Land Use Bylaw is, why we're working on it, give you an idea of work we've completed already, work that is ongoing, and give you a sense of what is coming up over the next couple of years. So I'll begin by explaining what the Land Use Bylaw is. The Land Use Bylaw is the policy document that is approved by City Council that regulates all development on private land. So anything from decks to how many residential units you're allowed to have on your property, to where commercial, industrial, and other uses are located in the city. And so along with the set of rules that is just text, we also have a map that I've displayed here on this slide. It's hard to read, but I'll point out the purple area to the northeast of the city, and that's industrial development. And so each property is assigned a zone, and each zone gives the property owner a sense of what they can build. The rules can really shape the types of buildings that are built, and so a building that is allowed in the purple area you would not see in other parts of the city, and that's because of the Land Use Bylaw. The Land Use Bylaw does impact where you can access services, and then also types of buildings. One thing the Land Use Bylaw does not do is regulating the user. So it does not regulate who can rent a property, who can own property, and what type of businesses can be located where in terms of ownership. It also does not regulate things that are regulated by the building code. So that's plumbing standards, electrical standards, HVAC standards. So there are limits to what the Land Use Bylaw can do. Land Use Bylaw focuses on land use, building types, and uses. We are working on rewriting the Land Use Bylaw for two reasons. One is the last time the City of Lethbridge underwent this type of exercise was 1987. And in over the last 40 years, the city has changed in terms of what type of buildings and proposals we're getting from private owners, but also the community needs have changed in that time. And the reason why we started this during this timeline is that in 2022, City Council identified this as a priority project and funded the project. And so we began in 2022. This is an exciting opportunity because the city has also recently completed other documents, like the Municipal Development Plan that sets the vision for the next 30 to 50 years for the City of Lethbridge. We've also completed the Climate Adaptation Plan and the Transportation Master Plan, which gives us a sense of where the city's going and some of the challenges we're facing today. The Land Use Bylaw is an opportunity to shape the future of our city. And although the regulations, if you were to pick up the Land Use Bylaw document, it's hard to relate to them because it is just text. And so we created this diagram that shows the connection between Land Use Bylaw and the type of communities we can have in Lethbridge. So underground is what the Land Use Bylaw regulates. So the Land Use Bylaw regulates density, parking minimums, density maximums, and different types of uses. Those are hard to relate to on their own, but altogether, they shape what people experience day to day. So the land use bylaw can impact how business-friendly we are, and also what type of housing and what type of services people have access to in our city. As part of this project, we're working on 8 different goals that relate to a range of aspects of community life. And so all of them are key, but I'll point out a few. So the land use bylaw recognizes that there's the importance of the environment, and as part of this project, we can assess the role that the land use bylaw can have to ensure that Lethbridge is ready for climate resilience. We also know that the land use bylaw regulates commercial industrial uses, and so the land use bylaw has a role to play to make sure that we can support and attract regional and local economic growth. And we can also ensure that as part of the land use bylaw, we are thinking of people who are the most vulnerable in our community and ensure that community well-being is something that everyone's able to achieve. And of course, the land use bylaw is a policy document, but we can always work to ensure that the policy document itself is user-friendly so that more people can utilize it and be more familiar with what impacts development in Lethbridge. As I said, we began this project in 2022, and we're currently in phase 2. So here under the new land use bylaw engagement is what we're calling it. Up to this point, we've done engagement and we've presented to you last year, I believe, and as part of that project, or part of that phase, we were focusing on social uses. Currently, we're focusing on all other types of uses, so that's residential, commercial, and industrial. And following this engagement period, which will wrap up sometime this summer or fall, we'll move on to the next phase, which is all about writing the new land use bylaw. This could take up to 18 months. And following this, we'll be back doing engagement to ensure that the community knows what changes are being proposed, and so that we can refine based on engagement feedback we receive. Once we have a draft that reflects the feedback we've received, we'll begin the council decision-making process. This will be a public process where council will be able to hear from you and further refine any changes as needed. The next few slides focus on the work we've completed so far as part of phase 1. So this was the guiding question that we were working with for phase 1. And so how can the land use bylaw help ensure that everyone in Lethbridge has appropriate housing for their needs and the option to access the social supports they need? Here are some of the figures that give you a sense of the context that we're working within. There are 2 figures that I'll point out. So Lethbridge was identified as the highest EMS responses to opiate-related events in Alberta as of 2018. And so this, we know that is related to addictions and something that people struggle with in our city. And this is related to land use bylaw because land use bylaw regulates supportive housing, which can support people regaining their lives and their autonomy and improving their quality of life. Another figure is that 20% of Lethbridge households have a person reporting a disability. This is valuable because we know that if someone wanted to be independent, they would need to have appropriate housing with the appropriate supports, and the land use bylaw does regulate supportive housing for people with disabilities. And so this table gives you a sense of how the land use bylaw directly regulates supportive housing. And so on the right-hand side, we have a list of the different zones. And so we have anything from downtown commercial to highway, shopping, and general commercial, which is type of Mayor McGrath, big box store development. And we also have public building, which could be like a school site, a public building, so no private residential. And then we also have regular residential districts, from mixed density residential districts to low-density residential districts. At the top, we have the different types of social uses, and so I'll highlight supportive housing at the far left. And so part of that, we have Ds and Ps. D means discretionary, and that is one way that different types of uses are approved. And so discretionary means that we have a use that is allowed, but it may not be guaranteed. Approval may not be guaranteed. Whereas permitted, and there's one P in this table, that means that the use is guaranteed to receive approval. And so you can see that even though it is allowed in various parts of the city, supportive housing is only allowed in a small proportion of zones in Lethbridge. And the fact that it's allowed as discretionary means that approval is not guaranteed. They might have to go through a different hearing, and they may still face opposition that result in refusal of an application. This is important because as of 2019, a study identified that Lethbridge needed 390 new supportive housing units, and between 2019 and 2022, only one application was approved for one more supportive housing unit. And so there's a gap in terms of what the need is and what the land use bylaw is allowing to be built and provided in Lethbridge. This is not a statistic we like to see, but since 2022 and 2023 and onward, City Council has approved a few supportive housing developments to fill this gap. We're not near to approving 390 beds or supportive housing units, but we are doing better than 2022. As part of phase one, we also conducted extensive engagement. So we conducted presentations like these to stakeholder groups. We had information online, we had videos, and then research documents. We also conducted a survey, and we had other traditional engagement sessions like open houses and workshops. And so a lot of work went into phase one, including the direction council provided, information found in the municipal development plan and other city documents like the municipal housing strategy. We also looked at what other cities were working on, and then we conducted public engagement. So from that, we identified several recommendations to change to improve the way that we regulate supportive housing and other related social uses. We hosted an open house, and then we had another survey to confirm the results and refine the recommendations. All of this resulted in a bylaw which recommended that council makes a few changes to the existing rules. As part of this work, council asked us to roll everything we've learned and all the recommended changes into the new land use bylaw, which is expected to be completed sometime in 2026. And so I'll pass it on to Ross to talk about phase two.
A little bit taller. Thanks, Genesis. So as Genesis mentioned earlier, phase two essentially covers everything else except social uses, which is what we engaged on in phase one. The reason we split social uses out into its own phase was because council had directed us at the start of the project to focus on that as a priority because of the needs in the community. So now we're in phase two, which began in January this year and runs right through till the end of June. That's when we'll be doing the engagement. And this is our overall guiding question for phase two that we're trying to answer through all the engagement that we're doing. So we need to kind of learn from the community what level of change people would be accepting of, because ultimately anything that we recommend has to be approved by council at the very end of the project through that public hearing process. So these are the topics for phase two engagement, and so we've taken kind of everything that's in the land use bylaw apart from social uses and tried to kind of group it into topics that are a bit more accessible to people. So you can think about what you're interested in, what you want to have your say in, and look for engagement activities that you can take part in that will speak to that. So I'll kind of go through each of these and give you a bit of an overview of what we're thinking. So the first one is housing. As Genesis mentioned earlier, the land use bylaw regulates a whole bunch of things around the built form of new buildings, as well as the use as well. And so a land use bylaw can really get as specific as you like and break things down to a fine level of detail, or it can stay quite vague. So we see examples from some communities who've produced new land use bylaws in the last couple of years, where they're making things much more kind of simple and flexible. So for example, Beaumont, Alberta, which is about 20,000 population, their new land use bylaw only defines housing as 3 different uses. So it's dwelling units, which is pretty much everything. They have short-term rental, which would be something like an Airbnb, and then they have a mobile home or a trailer park type of use. We, on the other hand, currently get a lot more specific and granular. So we have different use definitions for single detached, secondary suites, which would be like a basement suite or a backyard suite, a duplex, townhouse, apartments. What else do we have? Fourplex. So we get really specific, and in some districts those uses will be allowed, in other ones they're not allowed, or they can be permitted or discretionary. And we also have a lot of different residential zones or land use districts. So if we look at the stats on the right of this slide, Edmonton's new land use bylaw, which was adopted just over a year ago, only has 6 residential districts for their whole city. Calgary's draft new land use bylaw, which they're hoping to adopt in the next year, only has 3 residential zones for the whole city, but we have 16. So we have all these different zones that kind of slice and dice things very finely, and you have a narrow range of density that's allowed in that district, and if you step outside that, you have to rezone and go through that whole very involved process. If you have fewer districts like these other 2 examples, and there are plenty of others, Medicine Hat's kind of the same, then there's less need for rezoning. So for example, let's say you have a small apartment building that has 4 homes in it, and you want to add an addition that would add a 5th home. Well, if you have quite kind of broad land use districts with a wider range of allowable density, then adding 1 additional home might be fine within your current zoning. Here in Lethbridge, because we slice things so thinly, you're probably going to have to apply for a rezoning, even just for something quite small like that. So there's some advantages to making things a little bit more flexible and having fewer different districts and fewer different uses as well. One of the big things that we're hoping to address through this project related to housing, of course, is the affordability crisis, which of course is being discussed all across Canada in the last few years. One thing I would say about Lethbridge is that it used to be seen that it wasn't really a Lethbridge problem. We had relatively affordable housing. I would say that's no longer the case. You can see in this graph, in the yellow line, we've got the median price for new single detached homes per year. And then in blue, we've got the median household family income. So you can see the 2 diverging. I mean, it's been going on for 20 years, but it's continuing. The house prices have really jumped up exponentially in the last few years as well, in particular. And then we see the same thing for rentals. So in blue here, we've got the vacancy rate for all rentals, which for 2024 dropped to 0.6%. So essentially, rentals in the city are just full, like there's no spare capacity. And then at the same time, of course, average rent has shot up, and of course the 2 are linked. So it makes it a landlord's market. They can raise rents, and if you don't like it, there's 100 people waiting to take your spot. So it's kind of a bit of a crisis. And we hear people who are looking to move here for a job, they've had a job interview, they've been offered a job, and then when they look to actually move here and take the job, they can't even get a response from a landlord. They're applying for hundreds of opportunities and not getting responses. So it is affecting our economy as well. And people used to think about housing affordability in terms of the effect on people who were already kind of struggling economically. But nowadays, we're hearing examples from people who are, 2 working adults with no kids, and they're still struggling to afford rent. The stats that we have here for average rent for 2024 was $1,440 per month. When we shared these stats with the Lethbridge and District Association of Realtors a couple of weeks ago, they said they think it's actually much higher than that. In their experience, it's more like $1,800 a month from what they're seeing. And that's, you know, not for necessarily a particularly nice place. That could just be like a basement suite for $1,800 a month. So it's kind of getting ridiculous, and we need to find ways to make it easier to add more housing stock into Lethbridge, and you know, look at our individual regulations around things like minimum lot size or maximum height. All these types of regulations have an impact on housing affordability. It's only one slice of the pie. We can't, you know, single-handedly through the land use bylaw make housing affordable, but we can certainly contribute to addressing the problem over the years. One of the other topics we're looking at is neighbourhood commercial. And so we've separated this out from the wider discussion of commercial and industrial uses. But we wanted to have the conversation with the community about what types of commercial uses, like shops or restaurants or what have you, daycare, what would you like to see actually in your neighbourhood? So if you look at some of the older neighbourhoods in Lethbridge, like this one, like London Road, you can see right across the street there was the Spud Nuts store. Just around the corner, you've got the Jasmine Tea Room and Lucky Star Guitar and so on. In Fleetwood, you've got Urban Grocer. So it used to be more commonplace that you would see these kind of small neighbourhood scaled stores that were just kind of built for people to walk to. That's obviously not as common in your neighbourhoods in Lethbridge. Things tend to be bigger scale, further apart, built more for motor vehicle access rather than kind of being in the heart of the neighbourhood and being walkable. So we want to have that conversation with people about, would you like to have that kind of return to more kind of small neighbourhood scaled commercial, as well as kind of the bigger stuff that you can drive to for your less frequent needs. So what would you like to be able to access within walking distance of your home, whether it's daycares or a coffee shop or a small grocery store like Urban Grocer. And so that's one of the things we're trying to hear from people about in the current phase. What we can do for that in the land use bylaws, we can look at allowing some of those uses at an appropriate scale in some the residential districts, and that could be, there's all kinds of rules that we can build around that, like it could only be on particular types of road, like a collector road, which is kind of a busier road typology, or it could be only allowed next to existing commercial uses, for example. So there's lots of ways to approach it based on what we hear from people that they would like to see. The next topic is looking at our commercial and industrial districts. So we call this topic local business and the economy. And similar to what I mentioned earlier about our residential districts, we see that currently we do things in a lot more complex way than other comparable cities. So Calgary and Edmonton are shown on the graphs here. They used to be more complex too, but it's just that they've kind of worked with their new land use bylaws to simplify things. But these certainly aren't the only cities we've looked at. We've looked at cities all across Canada, and in particular in Alberta, and we're seeing this as the general trend is towards simplification and flexibility. So currently we have 6 commercial districts in Lethbridge, whereas the comparisons from Calgary and Edmonton are just 3. And you know, our current commercial districts, again, get quite specific. Like we have a shopping mall commercial district, which isn't even used for Park Place Mall downtown. So it's like, do we actually need that district anymore? Can we just consolidate it? We have a local commercial district and a neighbourhood commercial district. One of the few differences between the two is that one is supposed to cater for people living about half a kilometre around that use. The other one's for 1 kilometre. So again, very, very small differences. And then when we look at our commercial use definitions, so that could be something like restaurant, retail store, cannabis retail store, and so on. We currently have 38 commercial use definitions, and you can see Calgary and Edmonton are roughly half that. So again, it's a way to cut down on red tape. If you imagine you had a business that you're moving into an existing space in the downtown and you want to lease that space and operate your business there. Let's say the previous tenant was a restaurant you're wanting to open a retail store. Well, right now you'd have to apply for a change of use permit. So you pay the fee. It would take, depending on whether it's a discretionary use or a permitted use, it could take even a couple of weeks to get your approval. If it's a discretionary use, it could be appealed by someone, and then you have to wait on the appeal. So if you can consolidate your use definitions into fewer definitions, then each one is kind of more broad, encompasses more different types of business, and you would look to kind of group them based on their impacts. And then that could mean that you just don't need a change of use permit at all. So it's cutting out that step for businesses and making it easier for them to establish or to move into new premises and so on. And then we see the same when we look at industrial districts and definitions. So we're pretty good in terms of the number of industrial districts. We only have 3, so we've got general industrial, heavy industrial, and business industrial, similar to Calgary and Edmonton. But for industrial use definitions, we've got 21, they've got 4 and 5. So again, they group their use definitions into much more broad categories of levels of impact. So it just makes things more flexible. So the next topic is downtown. Our downtown currently has its own district called Downtown Commercial, which covers pretty much every property in the downtown. There's only a few exceptions. It's a pretty flexible district. You know, it allows apartments and things as well as commercial uses. One thing we want to look at is how we can make it easier for businesses to move into existing buildings. What you'll see quite a lot in the downtown is that you'll get buildings that cover 100% of the property, because of course they were just built in a time when you didn't need parking off street. So it can be tricky for someone moving into an existing building and perhaps not meeting modern requirements like parking requirements. Even if they want to expand a little bit, we have rules around, you know, whatever the floor space is that you're expanding, you would have to provide the required parking for that floor space. So can we make things more flexible to make it easier for businesses downtown? And also, what type of environment do people want? This image here shows our current regulation for the downtown, where the dark grey area is our pedestrian core area. And so that requires that any new buildings in that area have to provide a building covering 100% of the parcel frontage that's on the street, or a pedestrian-oriented area, so it could be like a plaza or something as well. It doesn't necessarily have to be building. So that's just intended to avoid more the type of development you'll see in suburban areas or in Mayor McGrath Drive, where you've got, you know, the sidewalk and then a huge parking lot and then the building, and you have to kind of walk through the parking lot to get to the building. So in the downtown, we're trying to maintain that more sort of historic feel, where you tend to have buildings built right up to the sidewalk and you can walk along the streets and look in the shop windows and so on. So we want to know, you know, do people think that's working? Do you want to see this pedestrian core area maybe even expanded? And, you know, what have you seen in other downtowns in other cities as you've traveled that you think would be great to have here? And then everyone's favorite topic, parking. Whatever type of engagement we do, if it's for like an individual development or rezoning or something, always the #1 thing that people are concerned about is parking. So we gave it its own topic. We've done various studies over the years at the city to look at how much parking utilization we have. So, for example, we did a study of big box stores, which would be like your big kind of Walmarts and Home Depots and so on, and found that, you know, the actual utilization of the parking provision they have is pretty low, and it's essentially never fully used, even on the most busy shopping days of the year. We did a similar study on the downtown in 2012, so that found peak parking demand was only 59% utilization. They did predict it would climb to about up to 79% by 2030, although that was before we built the park and ride a couple of years ago. You can see in the image here, all the red areas are off-street parking. So you can see how much land it takes up in the downtown, which, you know, potentially could be used for other things. When we look at different eras and forms of development, in Lethbridge, we can see the effect that the parking requirements can have on things like property value and the way that land is used, whether it's used in an economically productive way or not. So in the left image, this is an aerial view of a portion of 13th Street North. And the assessed value per square meter, when we average it out across that area, is about $850 per square meter. The middle image shows sort of a mid-century strip mall style of development nearby on 13th Street North. And the assessed value there is only $480 per square meter, so a little more than half. And then finally on the right, we have a big box store style development, and the assessed value is $468 per square meter. So when we have minimum parking requirements that are too high, or we allow developers to kind of build even more than the minimum, which tends to happen with big box stores, it does have an effect on the land values, because that parking space is not economically productive in itself. That has knock-on effects on property tax revenues as well. And when you think about how much public infrastructure is being taken up by these different styles of development, you can see how, for example, with the big box store, that's pretty much like a whole city block. All the linear infrastructure that goes around that site, every linear meter of road, all the pipes underneath that road, any wires, all that kind of stuff, you would at least want that property to be paying for itself, if not kind of contributing to the wider city. But the lower property value per square meter means that that may not be the case. Whereas the example on the left, the more sort of traditional urban form on 13th Street North, similar to what you'd see downtown or in the warehouse district, actually pays a lot more property tax per square meter, even though people would tend to look at a street or a block like that and think that it's fairly sort of cheap property compared to something like a big box store. There's also benefits to that smaller scale of development, like on 13th Street North, where those smaller properties are more accessible for local businesses, small businesses to purchase and kind of build wealth in the community that way over time as well, instead of just kind of being a tenant and leasing a larger property that tends to be owned by big national or multinational commercial property companies. So there's all these kind of factors that we have to take into consideration. How can we help kind of build wealth in the community? How can we make sure that development is paying for itself? And parking requirements certainly factor into that when you think about how land is used. So the trend we've seen with other cities in Canada in the last several years has been to remove minimum parking requirements and essentially leave it up to each individual homeowner or developer or builder how much parking they provide. So Edmonton removed all minimum parking requirements in 2020. Calgary removed everything except residential parking requirements, so they still require a certain number of off-street parking spaces per home, and that varies by district. Some of them it's just half a space per home. So, for example, you have 10 apartments, you have to provide 5 parking spaces. But yeah, all the other examples here removed all minimum parking requirements. So even smaller communities like High River, Medicine Hat, they've removed minimum parking requirements. I will provide a caveat to that, which is that the building code still requires a certain amount of accessible parking stalls off-street. So that is still a requirement in all these cases. But essentially, what this means is just that in terms of your standard off-street parking spaces, it would be up to you how much you provide. And so essentially the philosophy behind that is the idea that particularly for businesses or homeowners, you will know what your needs are. You'll know how many spaces you want to provide for parking, or whether you'd rather just kind of park on the street and not have a driveway or a garage. That's up to you. And for businesses, the idea is that the business owner knows their customers, what they need, what's going to benefit their business, what's going to work for their business or not, and it's essentially leaving it up to them rather than saying, we as the local government know best, we know better than you do about your business. So that's an option that we're looking at, and again, we're through this engagement phase, we're looking to hear from people about that. Whether you think we should go the way of all these other cities and remove minimum parking requirements, or whether we should keep parking requirements and potentially change them from what they currently are. And then the final topic I'll highlight is notifications, which again is another one that comes up quite a lot that people are interested in. So there are certain requirements in the Municipal Government Act about what we notify people about and how we notify them. So for example, for a rezoning application, we have to advertise the public hearing, and certain ways we have to do that, like in the local newspaper, for example. We can certainly go further than what's required in the Municipal Government Act, and we do currently. Like, we send out a letter to nearby homeowners when we receive an application. We send out another one when we have a public hearing date. We advertise on the city website and so on. So we're looking at here through this engagement what people care about, what you would like to be notified about versus what doesn't really bother you and you don't feel you need to know about it. And then which methods would you like to be notified by? So do letters work best, letters to nearby homeowners? How far do we go in terms of that definition of nearby? Do we need a better facility on the city website to notify you? So for example, this bottom right image is from Calgary, from their system, where you can kind of scroll around their map and look at all the current applications in the city for development permits and rezonings and so on. The upper right image is a postcard from Edmonton, so they send out these standardized postcards instead of the letters that we use. But there's a lot of different options that we can look at. We have, again, compared with a number of different cities, and currently we're somewhere in the middle in terms of how far we go with notifications. So we notify to a distance of 60 meters is kind of our standard. So if there's a rezoning application, we go out 60 meters in every direction and mail letters to those homes, which, depending how kind of dense the development is in that area, could be 10 people up to 100 different people. In Calgary and Medicine Hat, they only notify the adjacent property owners, so just like the next door neighbors either side in most cases. And then some other communities use 60 meters like we do. The furthest one we could find was Kingston, Ontario, goes to 120 meters, but they were kind of an outlier. And then there's other things we can do, like we can place a notice sign on the actual property so that people who are just kind of walking past can learn about it as well. That's another option we can look at. So there's a lot of different options there that we want to hear from people about. So that kind of covers the different topics we're engaging on through this whole phase. Behind the scenes, what we're working on at the same time is we need to understand the current state of things, because any new rules we come up with, any new land use districts, use definitions, we need to understand exactly what's out there today so that we can make sure that we don't write new rules that don't work with what already exists. So, we're not starting with a blank canvas where we can write any rules we want. We have to make sure that we're not creating any problems, any non-conforming uses with our new land use bylaw. So we've done a ton of analysis and we're still working through it. Just a few examples here of things we've been working on. So for example, the upper left graph there shows the height when people have been applying for height waivers in residential districts. What is the height that they're looking to build to? So for example, if they're building a new house or they're building a detached garage with a suite above it, what height are they looking for? And we can see over time that height has been increasing. So there's things we can do there. We can say, oh, where do we draw the line? Because if we raise the allowable height you can build to, that's going to cut down on red tape. It's going to cut down on the number of applications people have to submit for waivers. But obviously, that's not like a zero-sum game. Like if you, the higher you go, the more impact you're likely to have on neighbouring landowners. So there always has to be a balance with any sort of new regulation that we're considering. So the ways we've been engaging through phase 2 so far is pretty similar to phase 1. So we've had a mixture of online surveys. There'll be another one coming up in June. We've had some new videos kind of explaining things to people on the website. We've produced these series of decoding papers, which you can download from the project website. So we've got one on all those different topics I described. So for example, decoding housing, decoding parking, and so on. We did in-person workshops, and I would encourage you, if you're interested in the project, if you haven't already, to go on the project website and add your email address, and we can send you an email newsletter about once a month to let you know what other engagement opportunities are coming up, so you can take part. We also went to a few different classes, so we spoke with a couple of different university classes. The upper left image here shows we went to a high school social studies class and spoke to them and tried to get young people involved in the process as well. We've had an open house, and we'll have another one coming up in June again. We also do a bunch of pop-up engagement. There's an example in the bottom right image. So that's where we go out and try and meet people where they're at, rather than expecting them to come to us at City Hall. So we'll go and set up somewhere like a library, or this example is from the Home and Garden Show. We've been to food banks, I think about 10 different types of places all over the city. And we just try and catch people as they're going past and give them information about the project and try and get them interested and involved. The upper right image is from the in-person workshops that we did at City Hall a couple of weeks ago. So, yeah, wrap up. Okay. So, and this is the last slide. So, essentially, what we're doing is taking all that input from engagement, from council's direction, and so on. And right now, we're trying to come up with kind of a high-level overview of where we want the new land use bylaw to go. So it won't be getting into all the details of every little regulation, because that'll take a year or something to work through. But we want to share with the public in June what we're thinking in terms of things like the land use districts and the allowable uses. So please, again, consider signing up to the email newsletter so we can let you know when the survey and everything goes up online in June. And then hopefully we can move forward into phase 3, writing the new land use bylaw. So this QR code will take you to the project website, which is that link written out there, if you want to sign up to the newsletter. So happy to take your questions, and thanks so much for having us.
Questioners, please line up here on this side, and we'll take as many questions as we can.
Thank you. I'm Ken Sears. There's a number of issues here. One of the ones I noticed was you seem to keep referring back to Edmonton and Calgary. Calgary, they have so many fewer zones, all the rest of the stuff. Calgary isn't working. Calgary will admit it's not working. And part of that reason is there are still so many barriers to redeveloping in the city core and towards the center of the city. And so Calgary is metastasizing. It's throwing out communities further and further and further from the actual city. And I suspect that could happen in Lethbridge. The second thing is, and this is more to the social housing, and this is the thing I think would like the answer to. I can think offhand of 4 large, vacant, urban retail buildings in this city. The Sears store, the old, the Bay soon, there's a Safeway store on the north side. Those stores have been sitting vacant, some cases for 5, 6, 7 years. I know you're running into problems with the property owners, but nonetheless, that is land really within the core of the city that could and should be repurposed. And I'd like your comments on that.
Thanks, that's a great question. I'll take the first part and then Genesis will take over. So Calgary, The examples I shared from Calgary in terms of the number of districts and so on are from their proposed new land use bylaw, so it's not in place yet, it's in draft form. The Edmonton one is their current one they adopted about a year ago. So what you see today in terms of Calgary's existing conditions is under their current rules. They did go through a big change last summer where you'll probably have seen it in the media, where it was called a blanket rezoning. So they rezoned all their residential land to, I think, one of 3 zones. And so we'll see how that plays out in the coming years, but that was aimed at making it easier to build more homes without having to rezone. So the way Calgary is today is mainly just based on what the rules have been for the past, several decades. So certainly every city has its own unique circumstances that it's trying to work through, and we're no different. We're not looking to copy what Calgary's done or Edmonton's done. We're looking at all kinds of different communities of different sizes to see what's best practice and what's working, what's not, and get ideas. But certainly our ultimate recommendation will be a made in Lethbridge solution.
For the second question regarding supportive housing in existing retail buildings, that is something we hear from other people, and achieving that would take a rezoning. Right now, supportive housing is not allowed in the buildings you've described, and so it would take a supportive housing provider to go to City Council to request changes to the zoning to add supportive housing as an use. What we often experience is people that live around or people that are in the city, they will acknowledge that supportive housing is needed, but neighbors often oppose those rezonings and proposals, and that results in council not providing approval. And so in practice, it could make sense, but we don't have a service provider that is willing to go through that process currently and maybe end up with no approval.
Hi, Deb Rakes. Thanks very much for the presentation. I think it's a really important topic, and I appreciate just how much work this very complicated thing is. My concern, or the topic, and Ross, you and I have chatted about it briefly a couple of times, which I never see in the printed things that you're looking to do, has to do with aesthetics. So I know there's been a lot of discussion about the 3 proposed multifamily things that are going up in this neighborhood. Personally, just speaking for me, if I see them built and they look something like Edith Cavell down the road with a nice roof line, some architectural look to it, I would think that'll be great. If they're a 10-story high-rise, plain, not appealing in my books, I would be less likely to support more of those in the neighborhood later. And then I think it gets a little more complicated in that I understand that occasionally, and I think that no one I've talked to has actually seen what those 3 are going to look like, so that makes it hard. But also it gets more complicated because I think there has been a few cases in the past where there has been a plan, an architectural look, and the builder has not stuck to that, and it went ahead anyways. So, comments. Thank you.
Thanks for the question. A land use bylaw can get into questions of aesthetics. It can be a little tricky because for a permitted use, it's allowed by right, and so you have to, if there's any rules around design, they have to be written out and really kind of quantified, which can be very hard for good design. Like, it's hard to write that into quantities and very specific materials and so on. But if you're providing more kind of guidelines to design, that can certainly be done. However, if something's a permitted use, it's permitted. So there's a tricky balancing act there. What a lot of communities do is they'll have a separate document. There'll be some kind of design guidelines that someone can refer to when they're making a decision. But again, that would only work really for discretionary uses and not permitted uses. Another tool that we have is area redevelopment plans. And so, for example, London Road has one, and that tends to get more into things like what types of aesthetics we work in a particular smaller area rather than the city as a whole. So that's another tool that we can potentially use. But I definitely appreciate your point that I think the details matter to people in terms of how things look and fit into the neighbourhood as to whether they would support those things being built. So yeah, thank you for the point, because we'll take that on board for sure. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Gilles Leclerc. My interest is in tiny houses, and I saw that there was a slide that showed that there was subject to use definitions, I guess, and I think a lot of places probably haven't defined what a tiny house actually could be. So how would, if there's any inroads on how Lethbridge is defining tiny houses, and as well, where would be the best zoning possibility where those would actually fit?
So what we've noticed is that we have heard of tiny houses being something that people want to see in Lethbridge. However, when we go through the approval process and applicants realize that they need to connect tiny houses to underground infrastructure, that increases the cost of building a tiny house. You're not just building a standalone building, you're investing in those infrastructure connections. And so even though the City of Lethbridge would welcome and be supportive of tiny houses, we haven't received anything that, or an application in which the applicant is willing to put in that connectivity. It's a small building for a high cost of infrastructure connection. And so part of this project is working with infrastructure departments to see where there are gaps that exist in the land use bylaw, like the land use bylaw would allow it, but infrastructure standards are a barrier. And so that's where we have to think of the land use bylaw as a small part of changing what is allowed in the city. There are so many other components that we need to consider as well.
My name's Cheryl Bradley, and I really appreciate that you've mentioned affordability goals as well as environmental goals to be integrated into the land use bylaw. So, and I understand that you're not down to the building code level of planning in a land use bylaw, but I'm wondering if you've thought of any measures that can be used to look at more long-term environmental improvements or affordability. And I guess one example would be that ensuring neighborhoods are designed or housing is designed to be very energy efficient or to allow for heat pumps or solar panels, so that in the, even if it is affordable, you build the cheapest housing you can in the short term, but in the long term, that may not be the most desirable outcome to reach the goals. So is there any way that that longer term perspective can be built into it? Thank you.
Thanks for the question. As you say, there are different tools to try and achieve that. The building code obviously is maybe the main one in terms of things like insulation and how the building is constructed and so on. There are some other levels of tools in planning that can be useful. So for example, the state of California brought in a rule a few years ago where they required, I think it was a certain percentage of homes in newly built neighborhoods to have their roofs oriented and designed for kind of optimal solar gain for solar panels. So that starts to get into things like even how the streets are oriented, and then the design of the individual buildings, which way their roofs are oriented, and the shape of the roofs and so on. That's probably not something we would have in the land use bylaw, but you know, it's something you can potentially do at a higher level policy document, such as the municipal development plan, potentially, I'm not sure. One thing that I think the land use bylaw has a really big impact on in terms of sustainability is allowing things like a mix of uses, so you can have greater walkability or bikeability. So I think you can really cut down on, building into the whole fabric of the city and need to use your car all the time. So giving you that option where you can meet most of your daily needs within an easy kind of walk or cycle or roll of your home. That's something the land use bylaw can certainly have an influence on, just by allowing those uses. And so that's something certainly we're looking at. Anything you'd want to add to that? Right, yeah, and efficient use of land I kind of touched on when we were talking about parking requirements, but certainly that is something that the land use bylaw in general can influence. So we have requirements in there about things like minimum setbacks from parcel lines. So in some cases it might be 6 meters as a minimum setback. Well, not necessarily every business is going to want 6 meters of green strip between their sidewalk and their parking lot. So things like that we can look at and see, can we use land more efficiently so it keeps the city more compact? So that's another thing we can influence. Yeah.
Hello, I am Katie Aurora, the NDP candidate for the foothills riding to our west. I have a question about allowing people to use their own residential home as basically a place to operate light commercial type businesses out of, things like cafes, restaurants, things like that. If you look at the actual cost involved in starting a business, one of the greatest barriers of entry is just the cost of renting an appropriate space. And in North America, we are fairly unique in that we do not allow people to operate these kinds of businesses out of their homes. You can look around the world and you'll see examples where people will operate, like a small restaurant off the first floor of their home while they live on the second floor. Have you looked into allowing uses like that in your bylaw review at all? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Currently, all residential properties can have home occupations. There are limits in terms of how many customers they can have, how many employees they can have, and then they also come with additional parking requirements. So there are barriers that exist today, but right now there is the opportunity for homeowners to operate out of their home in early stages of their business. We have one district for new areas that's called low density flexible residential district that does allow a broader range of commercial uses. We have not seen anyone use it in Lethbridge, so even though we have a district that is ready for developers of new subdivisions to pick up and build under that district, no one has done that before. And so it's part of the conversation. And so we are asking people, what is the appetite to change the composition of residential uses? Should we have a commercial component? And what are the parameters in terms of building height, building standards? So thank you for the question.
We have 2 questioners left, and that will conclude.
Hello, my name's Mary Tedder, and thank you for your presentation. I just have one question, and that's dealing with parking. I know parking's a contentious issue downtown. I like to ride my bicycle, and I know that's also a contentious issue downtown. But what I notice is, even though I like to go downtown to shop, there's no place I can actually leave my bicycle and park it safely. I noticed that the University of Lethbridge does have lockers for bicycles. When is the city going to put some of those downtown?
Thanks for the question. So the land use bylaw only deals with developable parceled land, so it doesn't deal with public right-of-way like sidewalks and streets and roads and so on. So in terms of public cycle parking infrastructure in the public right-of-way, that's dealt with by our transportation department. So it'd be a good question for them. I know they have the cycling master plan, but I'm not sure if it gets into cycle parking on streets. Sorry.
Bev Mundell-Atherstone. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for your presentation. I thought I'd be bored I wasn't, so thank you. I've gone to City Hall many times in supporting Lethbridge Housing Authority for their bylaw changes in terms of numbers of people in supportive housing. And I'm wondering, how much would your proposed changes, reductions, impact supportive housing and such structures? And if you wish to simplify the Lethbridge bylaw structure and increase mixed-use neighborhoods, it appears there would be reluctance from those who wish neighborhoods would remain homogeneous, which might be referred to as NIMBY. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. For supportive housing, the proposed changes, they're available online, so we can provide a link to Canute for you to view them. It's also a video recording of council responding to these changes, but it would make it easier by changing the way they're allowed. So instead of being allowed as discretionary in all districts, we identified a few districts where they could be allowed by right. In those cases, we did set parameters in terms of scale. So just because it was permitted, it didn't mean they could build up to 50 units. The scale mattered for different parts of the city. And so that's one way. In terms of the feedback we're receiving, it's on the spectrum. We hear from people that are excited about change, and we also hear people that are comfortable with what we have and want to see more of what we currently have. Both perspectives are valid, and the question we're posing to the community is, we have challenges in our community. There are changes that need to happen to better support everyone living in Lethbridge, but how willing are you as a community to accept change? And so that's what we're trying to gauge through the engagement process. We don't approve anything, we don't finalize anything at City Hall. It all happens in council chambers. And so that question will continue to be posed to the community. What's your willingness to make changes in the community to ensure that not just yourself, but other members of the community have access to the housing services that they need in the community? So it is about willingness, and we have had conversations with people that once they hear the reality of other people that they don't interact with, about how young students are not able to stay in school. I spoke to a professor in the education department at the university that expressed that in his 20 years of teaching, he had never seen so many students drop out of their education program during the practicum part of their education. So at that point, students had invested a significant number of years, money, getting their education, but they can't do their practicum full-time and work enough to pay for housing. And so they have to choose what they can do. And so that's the level of impact the housing situation is having on young people in the city. And so once we share facts like that with members of the community, their willingness to change is assessed. And so that's what we're aiming to do as part of these conversations.
Thank you for your presentations. Would you mind giving us a brief take-home message to conclude today?
Thank you. Thanks very much for having us. Really appreciate it. And sorry if I went over a little bit. The take-home message is really just please do visit the project website and preferably add your email address, and then we'll send out an email about once a month and just let you know when the surveys and the open house and all that kind of stuff is coming up. So yeah, we'd love to get your input on everything. Thanks.
Thank you. Have a good day.